In 1415, King Henry V stood on a muddy field in northern France with fewer than 6,000 archers. Over the next few hours, those men would lose somewhere around 500,000 arrows into the advancing French army. 500,000! And when you hear that number, the first question is obvious. Where did all those arrows come from?
But the real question, the one that almost nobody asks, is far more interesting. What kind of invisible machine existed behind those archers that made that volume of destruction even possible? Because those arrows did not just appear in barrels on the battlefield. Every single one of them required specific wood, specific iron, specific feathers, and specific string. Each of those materials came from a different place, passed through different hands, and traveled different roads to reach the same quiver on the same archer's back. What nobody knew at the time, or at least what nobody thought to write down in simple terms, was that medieval England had essentially built one of the first military-industrial supply chains in European history, and it all revolved around one weapon, the English longbow.
So how does a medieval kingdom with no factories, no railways, and no standardized manufacturing produce millions of arrows, tens of thousands of bows, and enough bowstrings to outfit an entire army? That question takes us across half of Europe, into goose farms and yew forests and blacksmith workshops that most history books skip right over. The longbow itself is where this whole supply chain begins. And the first problem England faced was a brutal irony. The most famous English weapon in history could barely be made from English trees. A proper warbow, the kind that could punch through plate armor at 200 yards, needed to be crafted from yew. Not just any yew. The ideal bow stave came from a yew tree that had grown slowly in a cold climate, on a mountainside where the grain stayed tight and the wood stayed dense. English yew existed, sure, but English yew trees tended to grow in relatively mild lowland conditions. The grain was often too loose. The wood was too soft for the kind of draw weights military archers needed, sometimes exceeding 150 pounds of force. So, England looked elsewhere.
And what happened next turned a simple material need into an international trade crisis. The best yew in Europe grew in the mountains of northern Spain, the Alps of northern Italy, and scattered across parts of what are now Germany and Austria. Italian yew from the regions around the Po Valley and the foothills of the Dolomites was considered the gold standard. The wood had exactly the right combination of heartwood and sapwood. The heartwood resisted compression on the belly of the bow. The sapwood handled tension on the back. Together, they created a natural laminate that no other timber could match. England began importing yew bow staves in enormous quantities, and when voluntary trade was not enough, Parliament got involved. In 1472, a law was passed requiring that for every ton of goods imported into England, a certain number of yew bow staves had to be included in the shipment. Wine merchants sailing from Venice and Genoa were specifically targeted. You want to sell wine in London? Fine, but your ship had better be carrying bow staves too. This was not a suggestion. This was law. And it tells you something critical about how seriously the English crown took this supply chain. They were willing to distort international trade agreements and burden their own merchant class just to keep the yew flowing. But the yew problem did not stop at sourcing. A raw stave arriving at an English port was not yet a bow. It needed to be seasoned, sometimes for a year or more, stored in controlled conditions to prevent warping or cracking. Bowyers, the specialized craftsmen who shaped staves into finished weapons, maintained workshops in cities like London and along major trade routes. The best bowyers could produce perhaps 2 to 3 quality warbows per week. For an army of 6,000 archers, you needed a pipeline of bowyers working steadily for months or years before a campaign even started. And each bow had a limited combat lifespan. Bows broke, strings snapped, draw weight degraded with use. A campaign might burn through bows almost as fast as it burned through arrows. Which brings us to the second, and arguably more insane part of this supply chain: arrows. During a pitched battle, an experienced English longbowman could loose between 10 and 12 arrows per minute. Some estimates go higher. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346,
English archers sustained volleys for extended periods that consumed arrows at a rate that medieval chroniclers struggled to describe. At Agincourt, those roughly 5,000 archers firing for even a few sustained volleys produced the kind of numbers that sound made up.
Somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 arrows were loosed in a single engagement. Producing arrows at that scale required a network of specialists that history books barely mention. The shaft alone needed straight-grained wood, typically ash, birch, or poplar, cut to a standard length of around 28 to 30 inches. Arrow makers, known as fletchers, operated dedicated workshops where bundles of shafts were shaped, sanded, and graded for weight and straightness. Inconsistent arrows meant inconsistent accuracy, and military arrows needed to fly in massed volleys, where even small variations could thin out the density of the arrow storm. Then came the arrowheads, and this is where the blacksmith shops enter the picture. Medieval arrowheads were not one-size-fits-all. A bodkin point, the narrow, square-sectioned head designed to punch through chainmail and find gaps in plate armor, was a completely different product from a broadhead, which was wider, bladed, and meant to cause maximum tissue damage against unarmored or lightly armored targets. Battlefield commanders needed both types, and the ratio depended on intelligence about the enemy's equipment. Smiths, who specialized in arrowhead production, sometimes called point makers, worked in clusters around major armory towns. The Tower of London served as England's primary royal armory and arsenal, and records from the tower show orders for tens of thousands of arrowheads placed months before planned campaigns. In 1341, records indicate an order for over 700,000 arrowheads in a single year.
That is not a typo. 700,000 from one facility's supply network. Each head had to be forged individually, hardened, tempered, and then socketed or tanged to fit the arrow shaft. The iron itself came from English mines and forges, but the volume demanded by arrow production competed with every other military need, from horseshoes to sword blanks to armor rivets. Iron was not unlimited, and allocating enough of it to arrowhead production required deliberate prioritization by the crown.
If you are finding this useful and want more deep dives into the hidden side of history, hit subscribe. We break down stories like this every week. Now, the fletching. This is the part that catches everyone off guard. Every arrow needed feathers. Specifically, it needed the flight feathers from a goose wing. Not duck feathers, not chicken feathers, goose feathers, and only from the wing. Because wing feathers have the rigid, asymmetric vein structure that makes an arrow spin and stabilize in flight. Each arrow required 3 feathers, trimmed and glued along the rear of the shaft. But here's the thing. You do not get 3 usable fletching feathers from one goose. A single goose wing yields maybe 2 feathers suitable for military-grade fletching. So one arrow needs feathers from at least 2 geese. Now, multiply that by 500,000 arrows for a single battle. You're looking at a minimum of 1 million geese just for the fletching for one engagement. England kept enormous flocks of geese. Certain regions, particularly the fenlands of East Anglia and Lincolnshire, became major goose-producing areas, partly because of this military demand. Goose feathers were collected during the annual plucking season, gathered by merchants and sold in bulk to fletchers. The crown sometimes requisitioned feathers directly, bypassing normal trade when war was imminent. And it was not just about quantity. Fletchers were particular about which wing the feathers came from.
You could not mix left wing and right wing feathers on the same arrow, because the natural curve of the vein would fight itself, and the arrow would fly erratically. Military fletching standards required uniformity. Left wing feathers on one batch, right wing on another, and never mixed. Managing that sorting process at scale across thousands of bundles from hundreds of different farms was its own logistical headache. Then there was the bowstring. A longbow string was typically made from linen or hemp cord, tightly twisted and waxed. Strings broke under the immense stress of a 140-pound draw weight, and a broken string in the middle of a battle meant a useless archer until he could restring from a spare. Every archer carried at least 1 spare string, sometimes 2, coiled and kept dry under his hat or in a waxed pouch. Hemp came primarily from domestic English production, but high-quality linen cord sometimes came from the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. Rope makers and string makers who served the military worked separately from those supplying civilian needs. Bowstrings had to meet specific twist counts and diameter tolerances. Too thin and the string snapped. Too thick and it slowed the arrow, reducing range and penetration. Waxing the finished string with beeswax made it water-resistant, which mattered enormously in the rain-soaked campaigns that English armies frequently fought through in France.
And all of this, every single component, had to arrive at the right place at the right time. Arrows were bundled into sheaves of 24 and packed into barrels or crates for transport by ox cart along rutted medieval roads. Bows were wrapped in oilcloth and shipped in bulk from port towns to staging areas near the coast. Spare strings were counted, waxed, bundled, and distributed among units before embarkation. The logistics train behind a medieval English army included dedicated carts just for archery supplies, sometimes dozens of wagons carrying nothing but arrows and replacement bows. Losing those supply carts to a French cavalry raid or a river crossing gone wrong could an army's offensive capability overnight. Consider what a single campaign looked like from a logistics standpoint. Edward III's invasion force for the Crécy campaign in 1346 required months of preparation. Ships had to be gathered, supplies loaded, horses transported, and thousands of barrels of arrows stacked in cargo holds below deck. Once the army landed in Normandy, those supplies had to move overland with the army, guarded against ambush, protected from rain, and rationed carefully because resupply from England might take weeks to arrive by sea. Every mile the army marched deeper into France stretched that supply line thinner, and archers were burning through arrows at a rate that no medieval quartermaster could fully predict. The English crown understood this, which is why the entire system was backed by law. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 required every man of fighting age to own weapons appropriate to his social class, and for the common archer, that meant a bow and arrows. Later statutes went further.
Edward III banned football and other games on Sundays, mandating that men practice archery instead. This was not about recreation. This was a national military training program enforced by local sheriffs and magistrates. The logic was simple but effective. If every village in England contained men who could already shoot, the crown did not need to train them from scratch when war came. It only needed to supply them, and supplying them was already expensive and complicated enough. Royal officials called Keepers of the King's Arrows managed arrow production and stockpiling. Commissions of Array, the medieval equivalent of draft orders, specified exactly how many archers each county had to provide, and often included requirements for the number of arrows each man had to bring. Counties that fell short faced fines. Bowyers and fletchers who failed to meet production quotas faced penalties. Think about what this means in practical terms. A county receiving a commission of array for 500 archers, each carrying 48 arrows, needed 24,000 arrows just for the initial supply. If the campaign lasted months, resupply shipments had to follow the army, which meant a continuous production pipeline back home feeding forward into the war zone. This was a medieval kingdom running a just-in-time manufacturing and logistics operation 4 centuries before the concept had a name. The whole system also created secondary economic effects that rippled through English society. Ewe importation enriched certain merchant families and trading ports. Goose farming regions gained economic importance far beyond their agricultural output. Blacksmiths in armory towns had guaranteed government contracts that kept them working through peacetime.
Bowyers enjoyed a protected trade with regulated prices, similar to a modern defense contractor. And the archery practice mandates meant that every English village had communal shooting ranges, known as butts, that served as social gathering points as well as training grounds. But this extraordinary system carried the seeds of its own destruction. The demand for yew was relentless, and yew trees grow slowly. A yew tree suitable for bow stave harvesting might be 60 to 100 years old. Across the 14th and 15th centuries, England, Spain, Italy, and the German states collectively stripped their yew forests at a rate that could not be sustained. By the late 1400s, complaints about yew shortages appear in government records across Europe. Venice, which had served as a major yew trading hub, began restricting exports as supplies thinned.
At the same time, the human side of the supply chain was fraying. Training a competent military longbowman took years, not weeks, not months, years. A boy would start shooting in childhood,
and the physical development required to draw a 140-pound warbow left visible skeletal changes that archaeologists can identify on medieval remains. Enlarged left arms, thickened shoulder bones, spinal deformities from asymmetric muscle development. These men were shaped by the weapon from boyhood. Compare that to a crossbow, which a soldier could learn to operate competently in a matter of weeks, or early firearms, which required even less training.
The longbow was the superior weapon in terms of rate of fire and effective range against most targets, but the crossbow and the handgun were logistically simpler. Their supply chains were shorter, their training pipelines were faster, and their ammunition, while still requiring production, did not demand the same sprawling network of goose farms, yew forests, and highly specialized craftsmen. There is an argument historians still debate about whether the longbow died from the top down or the bottom up. From the top, the crown grew less willing to enforce the archery mandates as gunpowder weapons proved their worth on continental battlefields. From the bottom, the common population found the years of painful training less appealing when crossbows and muskets offered a faster path to military service and the pay that came with it. Either way, the pipeline of trained longbowmen began drying up by the late 1500s, and once that pipeline closed, reopening it was essentially impossible. The longbow did not disappear because a better weapon replaced it overnight. It disappeared because the system that supported it could no longer sustain itself. The yew was running out. The trained archers were aging and not being replaced fast enough. The cost of maintaining the entire infrastructure, from the import laws to the practice mandates to the royal armories, was climbing, while cheaper alternatives were becoming available. By the mid-1500s, English armies were transitioning to firearms. The last major English battle where longbows played a significant role was Flodden in 1513. By the time of the English Civil War in the 1640s, the longbow was a relic. Not because it could not still kill effectively. A skilled longbowman in 1640 could still outshoot a musketeer in rate of fire, but there were almost no skilled longbowmen left, and rebuilding the supply chain to create them was no longer practical. What makes this story remarkable is not just the weapon itself. Every history video about the longbow talks about draw weights and armor penetration and Agincourt. What almost nobody talks about is the invisible machine behind it.
The trade routes, the laws, the goose farms, the yew forests, the blacksmith contracts, the string makers, the transport carts, the county quotas. That machine is what made the English longbow a dominant battlefield weapon for nearly 2 centuries. And the collapse of that machine is what ultimately killed it. The English longbow was never just a weapon. It was an entire economy, an entire logistics network, an entire national policy built around bending a piece of wood from a tree that did not even grow in England. And when that network broke down, the weapon broke down with it. If this changed how you think about medieval warfare, hit subscribe. We have more stories like this coming that dig into the parts of history everyone else skips.